blockade, with the situation in the world. It does make it difficult. But that said, on basic things, in terms of providing for the basic needs of people as best that a poor society and confronting all the things done, they continue to work on those things, so that education, free education at all levels. In healthcare, when I was last year, I was talking to a friend. He's a physiotherapist, his wife is a dentist. He works in a community in Alamar. I don't know if you know Alamar, it's just outside of Havana, and around Havana, near. And they have, he worked in a thing with, I think it was him, there were 2 doctors, there were like maybe 6 or 7 other medical personnel dedicated to that, in that one area. There were 3 medical centers in the area like his. And I said, how many people do you treat? The 8 people who are responsible for a group of people. And he said, 40. 8 people dedicated to taking care of 40 people. And he said, but sometimes we have people coming from outside that area too that we have to treat additionally. I said, well, how many would that be? Oh, another 20. I mean, I'd love to have my doctor treating that small number of people. So there's a real effort to deal with the basic kind of needs that people have. When you look at what happened with Cuba's confronted not only the stuff with the blockade, but like climate stuff, the hurricanes that they had last year. And you compare, I had a friend from Cuba actually at my place. She had come for 3 days to pick something up, and then she ended up having to stay 10 days because she couldn't go back to Cuba after the hurricanes that devastated the country. They lost half their tourist infrastructure. And she was going back, when she went back to Havana, so she was in contact with her daughter, and 2 days after the hurricanes, they were already in many areas getting the lights back on, getting things running. There was a town outside of Havana, not too far on the north coast, that was completely, the whole center of the town was underwater, and they redeveloped that within almost no time. Compare that to Puerto Rico, which is still half the country doesn't have electricity. The people are dying because they don't have medical care. So you compare, there are issues, there are problems, and not saying that there aren't issues and problems is, I don't think, benefits anything, but then how they try to confront it. They had, when the hurricanes were coming in Cuba, they knew they were coming towards the coast. I had a friend whose wife was pregnant, and I was worried about it. All the pregnant women in the area where the water was coming in had been taken inland days before the water came, further inland, so that they wouldn't be affected and were given treatment or taken care of medically. All the pregnant women, the level of organization in the society. And so those kind of things, and they're very careful about trying to maintain all the basic needs for people there. So there are problems, there are issues, and there are things that people don't want. But the other thing I can say is, when I talk with my Cuban friends not last year, the year before when I was there, I went to visit, and it was shortly after, just a couple of weeks after Fidel had died. And, you hear, Fidel and the dictators and people don't. And I went there, and everybody I met, everybody I met, the first thing they went to, oh my God, we couldn't believe it. And we cried, and we cried. And they would all tell me that they were, how surprised they, even the Cubans, the young people were out in the streets crying at the death of Fidel and organizing, so there's, even when people are critical, and they are critical of problems, and there are problems. We have problems here. You have problems in Sri Lanka. Everybody has problems. But nobody. 3 people, 10 people, 100 people. People don't want to go back to what they had before, and they don't want the US coming in and taking over, and they'll tell you that all the time. They don't want that. So there's a lot of innovation going on now. There's things we look at, but I mean, over and over again, you talk to people and people who thought, Cuba wasn't going to make it through. From, as Liz was saying, at the time of the special period when people had no food. I had friends who were frying the peel from grapefruit, and that's what they had to eat. Nothing, no food in the country. And they survived it, and they fought back, and not only themselves, but then they go and they're all around the world providing support for people. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was in Ecuador for 6 weeks. A friend of mine was a Cuban doctor who was heading a medical clinic. They're providing free eye surgery in countries all around Latin America. In Ecuador, which is a much wealthier country than Cuba. And and every day, people would come into the clinics and have free eye surgery done, taken care of, absolutely provided by Cuba, right? But that was in Ecuador, and that was in Uruguay, and that was in Chile, and that was in countries all over Latin America, all over the place. The brigades that go around the world. So the Cubans are, they got problems, yeah, but my God, they're an amazing people. And what they try to do for themselves and for other people in the world is something really amazing.
So they are a model in eradicating illiteracy and providing education, health services to all over the world, Cuba. Even about 1 or 2 years ago, the United Nations, some of the United Nations agencies praised Cuba for providing services for Ebola. And by the way, you talked about the environment protection. Nicaragua and the US were the 2 countries in opposing the Paris Accord on Environment. United States said that it was too harsh, but Nicaragua said it is too lenient. So for the opposite reasons, they opposed, and finally I think Nicaragua signed this accord. You can talk, if you want, you can talk about Cuban support for the liberation movements, because to Angola, Namibia, and even South Africa, and all over the world. And Nelson Mandela, when he was released and he came to the States, and these people, they were against the majority rule in South Africa, and all of a sudden they woke up and they praised Nelson Mandela. And there was a specific question about Cuba, and he said something praising Fidel Castro. They were the people who supported us during our difficult times. And I yesterday read something about the Angolan vice president praising Cuban President Castro, because they were the people they supported. They supported in terms of the militarily as well as in the construction of the country, the whole Angola, in South Africa, even Namibia. So Cuba is a mecca for the liberation movements. And by the way, you may want to know, Sri Lankan Tamil group, liberation group, they went to Cuba in 1978. because there was a World Youth Conference. They attended the World Youth
The youth
Conference.
festival, yeah.
in Sri Lanka.
1978?
Yep, youth
Where was
festival
it?
in
Cuba,
Havana.
yeah, the World Youth
Yeah,
Festival.
there.
Yeah.
But later on, when this the liberation papers of Tamil was defeated in Sri Lanka, they were against Cuba. They were against Cuba because they said that the Cuba supported the Sri Lankan government in the UN, in the United in Geneva, the United States, United Nations Human Rights Council. Cuba supported Sri Lanka, so they were these liberation tigers of Tamil or these Tamil nationalists against. But personally, we support Cuba, and the Cuba was right to not to support these people because they knew that these people were and are pro-imperialist.
Pro-imperialist.
Yeah,
That was it.
they are out and out pro-imperialist. So Cuba is right to not to support these people.
Excuse me. Now we have to come back to the Cuban visit and our experiences. We have to. That's our main idea. And very recently, I think last month we visited to Cuba, and as he mentioned about the Cuban situation. When we see the people are very, they are smiling and they are happy, but we couldn't understand how their life is, day-to-day life is going on, and even though we visited to a comrade home and we had a lunch there, we know their water problem. And in the morning, early morning, 7 to 9 or 7 to 10, they get the water. Then they fill all the water in some tanks, and they are using that. That's all the problems they have, but their life is very happy. Particularly one thing, there is no racism or that sort of things I didn't see, because even in out of the hotel, when we talk to the people, whether they are the blacks or whites or other colors, all are in the same. They are in the same mentality. They are very equal. That is the one important thing I noted, and I hope that the comrade also you can give some more information about Cuba, because a lot of our people, because Cuba, the weather situation is very close to Sri Lanka. We are Sri Lankan immigrants. There are a lot of people now they are visiting Cuba. But we know that there's very open nowadays. We even in the hotels. There's an officer. She will give you more information about all the place where you can visit, how you have to handle the simple matters, and we want to know more about what are the inside system of the Cuban government or Cuban society. That's we want to know, and we try to go and visit the Cuban museum and other things.
You pretty much visited all the parliament. How do you say that? Capitol.
The Capitol building?
You visited Capitol. We visited the monument of
Museum of the Revolution.
Museum of the Revolution, and then
The War Museum is next door.
the pole building, the pole tower.
Jose Marti.
Jose Marti is building. So we pretty much visited all the important buildings in Havana, the political important, historical important buildings in Havana. The only thing we missed was Che Guevara's house. I only found out after. That was the house.
Back to some of what you were saying, there was a lot in there. And a lot of different facets to go down. And anecdotally sort of, there is racism in Cuba, but it's very subtle. I've concluded, because they're all in that same boat, and when you look at the age of most Cubans, most of them have grown up knowing nothing but the revolution. So from that perspective, they all understand you're no different than I, but the tone of your skin does make a difference there, but like I said, it's very subtle. Now, on my first trip to Cuba, my first trip was there, I believe 2013, and one of the places we visited was the Museum of the Revolution. And after we had done our tour, we were out on the, I call it the veranda or the porch. You come with the big large doors and we're standing out there with the pillars, and there's the 5 or 6 stairs down to the ground. Well, part of the group I was with, and his son Terry, we were out there waiting. Some of them were in the bathroom. And we were standing there talking and having a smoke, and out of the blue, a cop was up in my face, jabbering, being very aggressive, and all of the above. And I was actually taken aback because I didn't know what was going on or what it was all about. And I happened to have a baseball cap on that had a little Canadian flag on the back, and right away I just said, I took it off, pointed the flag at him, Canuck, sort of deal. Not that he understood what a Canuck was, and that's just another name for a Canadian, sort of deal. And he realized that I wasn't a Cuban at that point.
You're in a tourist area and that,
Because the local Cubans aren't allowed up there because they don't want the tourists harassed. Whether they're asking for money, cigarettes, or anything like that. And I get mistaken quite often when I'm there for and as a Cuban. Personally, it amuses me because, I know 6 words of Spanish, but everywhere I've gone in the country, on these brigades as such, the different groups we've met, they have these things all across Cuba. They're called CDRs. They're Committees for Defense of the Revolution. And that would be a local community group that gets together and they plan things for their communities. This is where, in the election process, it would all start. So from your local community group, those who want to run would put their names forward. But let's say, this block is this group, that block is the next group. And even for the total number of candidates are required, out of those local groups is where the candidates come and the votes come, et cetera, but that's where it all starts. And on the brigades, almost, I'd say 4 out of 5, we've gone to one of these CDRs, and what they basically are is the local community getting together to throw a party for us as visitors, sort of deal. They bring out entertainment, the whole community comes out, streets get shut, music, food, in most cases, and it's just, we get to have exchanges like this with not only them, but a lot of different NGOs. We meet with women's groups, we visit hospitals, have exchanges with doctors. We've, in my trips, I've met with doctors who have been to West Africa during the Ebola virus and got to talk to them about the exchanges, et cetera. Moving east in Cuba, Santiago, the 2nd largest city, a lot of history there. That's where both Fidel and Raul were born, will be buried in different cemeteries. But I've been to their birthplaces, homes, their early schooling. It's a place called Verón in and around Santiago. Fascinating place. And the stories, it's been cut down in size. It used to be thousands of acres. It's much smaller now, but all the buildings are still there, a lot of the old furniture. It's very historical. And if on one of your trips back, if you get the chance to go there, you'll really enjoy it. Santiago itself, there's a lot of history. As you know, in most cities in Cuba, they have a Revolution Square from Havana to Holguin to Santiago, Guantanamo, which I've had the honor of visiting also as part of these brigades. Each year, the brigades that the CNC sets up, for the most part, they try with the organizers in Cuba to make it different. They will always highlight the best of what Cuba has to offer, and you'll always get a ground roots visit with the people. You do get close to the people. We visit schools for the arts, the schools, elementary, high schools, universities. We've had exchanges with professors on different subjects. ELAM, the medical school that somebody mentioned earlier, we've been there and had a tour and had exchanges with the professors. Rehabilitation centers and some of the work that they're doing with both youth and adults, and it's fascinating to see. And we keep talking about the difficulties that Cubans have in terms of retrieving resources, etc., etc. Agriculturally, they've developed so many methods to increase production of their foods, even though most of what they produce agriculturally is for local consumption. They do have a couple of major products that they do have for export. That's sugar, obviously because of cane and stuff like that. Most of the sugar goes to China. I'm not 100% sure on it, but I'm guessing in terms of a trade program, eyewitness buses will give you sugar. And the rum they produce, most of the rum they produce goes to Spain. I'm not sure what they would be getting back in terms of for that, but these are the kinds of things that Cuba has done to improve life for people as much as possible. Tourism and agriculture are their two big things. Canada right now can still be proud that we are the largest tourist numbers into Cuba. We're usually about 1.2 to 1.4 million people a year. And you were talking earlier about the conditions they're under, and everybody seems to be smiling. That was one of the greatest impressions I came out of Cuba with, even after my first visit. Given those conditions, and I've never met a more spirited people, a more positive people about their future anywhere. Not that I've traveled a whole lot of places, but I've never met a more friendly, a more warm, and a more hospitable people anywhere. And that's what keeps me going back, sort of deal. A palm tree is a palm tree in terms of the Caribbean. The palm trees in Cuba are cheaper to look at than they are in Jamaica, Barbados, or even though they're nice islands. I honestly eat better in Cuba than I do here, partially because of the cost of fruit and a lot of fresh vegetables. As you can tell, I don't eat a lot as it is, but I could eat pork and rice all day. So that's an ideal place for me, but I do drink a lot more juices and fruit. So between the spirit of the people and a healthier diet, I'd love to live there.
I wanted to say something with regard to what you were saying too before. I agree with the spirit of the people. I've never met anybody anywhere like the Cuban people. When you talk about the question of racism, people, as you said, I mean, people do, especially young people and people who've grown up, there's people mix at every level, and that's absolutely true. But there's also a history to the country, and 60 years ago, before the revolution, racism was endemic in the country. I mean, this is a country that was based on slave labor, sugar plantation slavery, and there was a huge division among
Separate beaches.
separate everything, and in terms of what people had. Now, revolution comes in 1959, and blacks in Cuba, by and large, were a lot, there were poor white people, but the black population was a lot poorer and had a lot less. And you have a revolution that's trying to provide as much as it can for everybody in terms of equality of education, healthcare, those things. But housing is a big problem in Cuba. Housing is a huge problem in Cuba. And every time they have another hurricane, and every time you turn around, there's another hurricane somewhere. And so whenever there's a plan to build more stuff here, then the money has to go there. And then they build something here, and the money has to go here. It's a big, big problem. And so if you have a history where the black population of the country was living in poorer conditions in 1959, there's been some ability to move from that, but still, by and large, there's still an issue with that because some people haven't necessarily been able to move out of where they were before the conditions are worse. I have one friend, I found out only a couple of years ago, she lives in a tenement, a kind of, one room with a little kitchen and whatever, no windows and whatnot. Martha we went to university together. She works in the archives. She's traveled in Spain and different places for her work. She teaches at the university. She's black, Cuban woman. She's a part of things, but she lives in a very small place, and her sister has an even smaller place in the same building. And I only found out a couple of years ago, and so this is part of history too, where she was talking about the fact that we were visiting another friend of mine one day, and she said, oh, well, we could have had an apartment like that, but at the triumph of the revolution, her mother was offered an apartment, and the mother turned it down. And so 60 years later, Marta's still stuck in this place because they hadn't had the opportunity to get another place. And why would the mother have turned it down? Because if you've lived your whole life in a racist society, pre-revolutionary, and the government, government offers you something at that point, you didn't trust it and you didn't believe it. And so, there's things that are still sequels from that period that now people are discussing, and the fact that there are issues that over history that haven't always been dealt with as fully as they need to be and haven't been addressed as fully. And so, but people are talking about that, and they talk openly about those issues and the fact on a level of day-to-day and interactions with people, there's a lot of things, but there are still issues that come from a past, and those are things too that we have to see where things come from, and then not just us see, the Cubans have to see, and then how they go about.
Can I take the note? Can I